The walls of Jerusalem glowed like an ember at dusk. Smoke rolled over the city's broken roofs, and the last light fell on the carved stones of the temple, turning them to a hard, sorrowful gold. In the crowd that moved like a river out of the gates, a young man stood with his eyes fixed not on the ruin but on a memory, a voice, a prayer taught at his mother's knee, a psalm breathed under the palms of his childhood. His name was Daniel. They led him away beneath banners of a distant king. Babylon's eagles rode the wind toward them, bronze and thunder. Daniel could have been swallowed by bitterness. He could have become another face in the caravan. Instead, he bent one quiet, deliberate knee when the opportunity came, then another, until the motion became the habit of prayer. In a world rearranged by conquest, he kept a position of the heart that no human ordinance could take. Exile was meant to erase. It sought to strip the children of Jerusalem of their names, their stories, their God. Yet it is in the crucible of removal that some souls are reshaped. Daniel was taken into the service of the king of Babylon, selected among the young men of noble birth to be trained in the language and learning of the Chaldeans. Ashpenaz, the official charged with their instruction, taught them the literature of empires, accounts of harvest and tribute, horsemanship and statecraft, the pomp of kings, and the ways of power. They learned to read the skies in patterns foreigners called omens. They learned even to smile politely when history had just made them spectators. But what Ashpenaz could teach with tablets and tutors, he could not implant in Daniel's private life. The young man carried a different education, one written in the rhythms of the soul. 3 times a day he turned his face toward the memory of home and folded his hands. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was fidelity in small things. When the palace offered its table, a litany of meat perfumed and wine that glimmered like sunlight, Daniel made a choice that would mark the rest of his life. He asked for vegetables and water. The request sounded insignificant in a court where feasts were power. Ashpenaz expected resistance, or at least compliance. To refuse a king's provision was to signal trouble. Daniel, however, spoke with the dignity of one who had practiced humility long before exile taught him to bear insult. He said simply, "Test your servants for 10 days. Give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink." There was a pause, the soft, watchful silence of those waiting to see whether piety would be punished. 10 days. The period was small, but it carried weight. It was a measurement of trust, an experiment of faith. At the end of that time, when the other young men looked sated and sluggish from spices and wine, Daniel and his friends appeared healthier, more alert. Their faces had not been starved, they had been steadied. The tutors began to see that the gift of God sometimes came on the back of discipline, the strength to refuse the easy, to choose the simple. From that modest table, other things grew. The ancient books speak of Daniel and his companions being given understanding and competence in every kind of learning. But there was a deeper endowment, the capacity to see the invisible architecture of events. Wisdom was not merely stored knowledge, it was the ability to interpret signs, the turning of a king's mood, the tremor beneath a courtier's smile, the hidden logic of a dream. Daniel received revelations that came like morning light. They were not contrived by cunning, but given. In the hush of libraries and the clatter of training halls, God began to make Daniel a voice the nations would hear. There is a peculiar pressure that attends giftedness in a foreign palace. When a captive's words become indispensable, admiration may follow, and admiration often breeds a dangerous thing, envy. But the court's wheels would turn slowly toward that hazard. For now, Daniel's life moved in credible increments. Study and prayer, counsel offered discreetly, the slow accumulation of favor. The real proving the narrative would show comes when the earth under the feet of men shifts unpredictably, when kings are moved by dreams and empires tremble at symbols. Nebuchadnezzar, the king whose name thundered through the region, was a man of grand gestures and restless nights. He had built the city of Babylon as though he meant to trap his name in bronze forever. Yet even a king's bronze dreams trembled in the dark. One night terror seized him, a dream that left him frantic because the vision and its meaning had fled him upon waking. He summoned wise men, enchanters, and magicians. He offered rewards and threatened penalties. There is a certain cruelty to a monarch who mistakes his power for omniscience. The one who cannot interpret heaven's warning is the most dangerous of rulers. The advisors could only offer the king ruses and recitations. None could render the secret that had vanished from the crown's sleep. Nebuchadnezzar called for a different kind of interpreter. He demanded the telling of the dream and its unraveling, a test meant to expose the so-called wisdom of the learned. News of the king's fury reached the ears of Daniel and his friends. They were not immune to fear. None are. Yet Daniel did not allow fear to determine his posture. He turned to God. "O Lord," he whispered there in the privacy of his chamber, the words of a man who had been taught to pray by the light of a fatherless city. "Give me understanding and favor in the sight of this king." The prayer was brief, unadorned. It was a plea, a petition couched in dependence, not a demand. It was a reminder that when imperial power sought to control the deep things of the spirit, the faithful answer goes where it has always been, to God. That night, as if in answer, Daniel received the revelation. He could recount the dream not because of cunning, but because the answer was given. He went before the king with humility and clarity. He spoke of a great statue, its head of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, images of kingdoms succeeding one another, each with its measure of glory and weakness. Then he spoke of a stone not cut by human hands that would strike the statue and become a mountain that filled the whole earth, a vision of God's kingdom outlasting and surpassing human empires. Nebuchadnezzar listened, moved first by the recognition of his own head of gold, then by the unsettling prophecy that even his grandest achievements were transient beneath God's plan. The king's response mixed awe with a monarchical instinct toward self-exaltation. He set Daniel over the affairs of Babylon, yet the appointment came with the human mixture of flattery and fear. A king may be grateful. He may also feel diminished by the reminder that a higher power sets the limits of all crowns. Daniel's rise was not merely personal promotion. It was the creation of a phenomenon, a visible testimony that the God of Israel still acted in the world. For people watching the arc of history, reputation is a fragile thing. An apparent miracle can vanish under scrutiny. That is why the narrative keeps showing the same pattern. God reveals himself in acts of mercy and rescue, and the world responds in a tangled knot of wonder and resistance. Word of deliverance spreads faster than law. The story of 3 other young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, will soon test that spreading reputation, for the witness of the faithful often provokes one of 2 reactions: worship or bitterness. When a man's faith is rewarded with favor, colleagues may wonder whether their fortune comes from God or from the crown. In the hush of palace corridors, envy is a slow poison. Officials begin to watch one another, to learn how to wield the system itself against those who stand apart. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his pattern. His prayers were not dramatic gestures performed to attract notice. They were the habitual schedule of devotion. Morning, noon, and night. He prayed in quiet rooms and behind woven curtains, sometimes aloud, sometimes under his breath, facing the memory of a ruined temple that was now a presence in his soul. Prayer was to him both shelter and sword. It shaped his appetite for the world and gave him a clarity that law could not take away. There is a theological observation to be made here for those listening. Prayer in Daniel's life is not a transactional device. It does not function like a formula to produce guaranteed outcomes. It is the locus of relationship, the steady canal through which courage and wisdom pass. The text invites no simplistic promise. Rather, it shows that habitually turning to God forms a person who can stand when everything else around him collapses. With Daniel at the heart of government affairs, foreign princes and satraps saw a new difficulty. His loyalty was not to a palace but to a god, and that translated into decisions that sometimes confounded courtly expectations. He judged wisely, he administered well, and he refused to let his faith be privatized until it ceased to shape public life. That conduct brought him esteem, an esteem that is as combustible in court politics as anything else. Time wound forward, and the wheel of kings kept turning. Nebuchadnezzar's grandiosity gave way, in the book of events, to his eventual humbling. But that story belongs further on. For now, what matters is that Daniel's gift opened doors, and open doors attract the attention of those who would use law as a weapon. Human systems favor predictability and obedience. They are ill-suited to the disruptive witness of those who will not bow to every decree. Where Daniel walked with integrity, he shone a light into the murk of political calculation. One afternoon, while scrolls were being read and accounts tallied, a rumor moved through the palace like a chill wind. The king's son, Belshazzar, had made a feast that mockingly used the sacred vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem. The tale arrived with the clumsiness of a rumor that knew nothing of reverence. It suggested that the memory of God could be trampled without consequence. When men treat divine things as trophies, they court a judgment that is not merely political, but spiritual. At moments like these, the narrative texture changes from the gray of administration to the electric color of confrontation. Men who had once displayed piety for practical ends now reveal their hearts. Will the memory of God prompt repentance? Will the sight of sacred vessels used as wine cups lead to humility? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it leads to catastrophe. The history recorded here shows both possibilities, the contrast no less a lesson for us. God's name is not an ornament. It is the axis of reality itself. Daniel watched these things with an awareness that extended beyond headlines. He had seen that God moves in dreams and visions, that empires are but temporary arrangements beneath an eternal sovereignty. His interpretations were not exercises in cleverness. They were at their core warnings and invitations. A nation that hears the interpreter of dreams must choose. Will it bend toward the justice the revelation calls for? Or will it harden and expose itself to the consequences of pride? And yet the palace is a surprising place. Human hearts are complex. Even the proud can be humbled, and humbled men can sing praise. Nebuchadnezzar's own story would bear this out later. The arc of God's dealings is not a simple line of punishment. It moves through mercy and correction as much as through judgment. Daniel's role was to speak the interpretation, not to control how men would answer. That remains true for every watcher and witness. To testify is not necessarily to secure repentance. Even as Daniel's reputation spread, he learned more about the spiritual dimension that whispers beneath human affairs. The book makes a few bold gestures toward the reality of heavenly beings, messengers whose ways intersect with ours, forces that contend beyond simple human sight. Names like Gabriel and Michael appear later as witnesses to a world in which prayer and vision have a cosmic significance. For the present, Daniel's access was simple. God gave him understanding, and he used it to guide kings. There was a cost. Favor draws the eyes of men who measure their own worth by the power they possess. It was predictable that jealous hearts would begin to conspire, learning how to couch malice in the language of law. It is a small lesson, but a solemn one. Evil is often ingenious in its use of legality. Men can sign their names to decrees with righteous faces, while the intent is something else entirely. One winter, when the light in the palace came in thin and hard, Daniel stood in the court and contemplated a law that would test the core of his devotion. I say contemplated, but that understates it. He examined his life and knew what the consequence would be if he refused a certain command. The court conspirators were already framing an ordinance, one that would forbid prayer to anyone but the king for 30 days. The wording would be beautiful in its legal precision. The spirit behind it would be bitterly personal. Would Daniel comply? The moral question is theatrical in its simplicity and enormous in its cost. For Daniel, the answer was already spoken in the small acts of his life. Prayer 3 times a day, the 10-day vegetable test, the habit of turning toward remembrance. These were not political maneuverings. They were the definition of his soul. When the decree was made, it was irrevocable under the law of the Medes and Persians, a phrase that rings like a doom in the ears of those familiar with ancient covenants. The conspirators smiled politely. They had used the machinery of empire to make private vengeance appear as the neutral hand of order. In that room full of statues and tapestries, they had framed their cruelty as integrity. News of the law reached Daniel as news travels when it has to cross the courtyard and enter a private chamber. Muffled, sudden, final. He could have ceased his prayers, adapted his outward habit to the new legal reality, performed devotions privately without facing the light. He might have found a way to live with the compromise. The world rarely forces us into drama. It usually offers 1,000 acceptable ways to betray our best selves. But Daniel would not take those ways. He continued to pray in the same cadence of his life. He opened the window toward Jerusalem as he had always done and knelt. He lifted his voice in the presence of his God as he always had. A simple, confident dependence that was neither showy nor theatrical, just consistency. "O Lord," he breathed in that small interior voice, "be with me. Help your servant now." The prayer was not grandiose. It was the plain petition of a man who had long ago measured the cost of fidelity. Someone watched. The court does not need to be loud to be present. It simply needs ears and the will to report. The conspirators moved like predators scenting fear. They went to the king and accused Daniel of breaking the law. Darius, who had appointed Daniel for his wisdom, found himself constrained by the legal cord he had signed. His admiration for Daniel turned to a private anguish. The law had been used as a trap. He confronted the paradox of his own prerogative, that a king's goodwill could be rendered impotent by the letter of what he had set in motion. Darius pleaded, bargained, and sought whatever means he could to reverse what had been done. Yet in the ancient world, some things bind more tightly than kings: oaths and the structure of law itself. The king's face hardened with sorrow as he realized the consequence. He could not unmake what he had authorized. The only recourse was a mercy that feels too slow and a power that seems invisible. Night descended. A procession moved through the palace gates with the dignity of legal execution. Daniel's fate was not carried out with spectacle, but with the grim efficiency of an age that had learned to hide cruelty behind procedure. The den was a pit of stone. Lions filled it as instruments of punishment more than beasts of habit. The world that had once pried Daniel away from his home now stood ready to consume him. We will pause here on the edge of that pit to remember what had led to it. A lifetime of decisions, small and large, rooted in prayer. A refusal to make faith private. The predictable human reaction to a light that exposes darkness. Jealousy and the legalism of vindictiveness. The scene before the den is charged with both cruelty and the possibility of deliverance. The heavens are quiet in the hush of the courtyard, but the story already suggests that what looks like an end may be only a beginning. There is a theological weight in this moment. When a man is placed between legal death and divine possibility, the witness of his posture matters. Daniel did not posture for effect. He remained steady, habitual, resolute. His choice would not be a spectacle of bravado, but the simple witness of a life aligned with God's presence. And yet the world was not without mercy. Darius, though bound by law, would rage against the injustice in his private sorrow. The conspirators would smile in the daylight and yet live on a strange, fevered margin. Their triumph fragile because it rested on rules rather than hearts. Daniel himself went into the den as he had lived, unafraid in that peculiar way that is born of long, habitual trust. In the cold stone gloom, the lions awake and the palace quiets. In the watchful chambers above, sleep refuses the king. The night expands, long, uneasy, filled with the small noises of an empire that will not let a heart rest. In that hush, a prayer from a ruined city, said again by a conqueror's captive, stands like a lantern in the dark. This is the hour when history leans forward. It is the hour before an answer is given, the night before a proclamation, the moment when the heart's true allegiance shows itself not in words, but in the willingness to pay the price. Daniel's battle is not only with the beasts below, it is with the forces that would make law into a weapon and loyalty into a crime. The world outside the den goes through its rituals. Courtiers whisper, guards shift, the instruments of empire keep their appointed tasks. Yet beneath the daily motion, something else stirs. The God who had taught a young captive to pray now stood at the threshold of a scene designed to make a king speak the truth of divine sovereignty. It would not be the first time, nor the last, that the Lord used what appeared as defeat to display his glory. The earlier days had already shown it. The dreams given and interpreted, the favor that elevated a foreign exile, the preservation of life where death was expected. Those histories were not isolated wonders, but a pattern. The palace clock, if one imagines such a thing in that place of bronze and tapestry, moves toward dawn. In the low-light rooms the king tosses and turns, and Daniel, who had been cast down below, remains in the company of beasts whose mouths the narrative promises will be closed. The tension is a rope stretched between sovereign silence and impending declaration. The outcome will not hinge on human plotting, but on a God who chooses to act. Before the sun climbs fully, the narrative has one last fold, what James would later call the testing of faith that produces steadfastness. Daniel's faith has been refined not by triumph, but by constancy. The true test of a life aligned with God is not whether it receives immediate vindication, but whether it keeps its course when vindication is delayed. That is the theme that had been woven since Jerusalem burned at dusk. Outside, the first glimmer of morning begins to cut the dark. The court, the king, the men of malice, all will soon hear what the night has withheld. Yet the story is not yet finished. The moment stands on the brink between ruin and revelation. Daniel's presence in the den is the fulcrum on which the rest of the tale will balance. A faithful life set against a law made to punish devotion, a king's regret pitted against the conspirator's ambition, and a God who has so often surprised rulers by revealing himself in the least expected places. Pause here and listen to the stillness that hangs over the palace. It has a sound like a held breath. The narrative has been building, exile and formation, wisdom revealed, favor drawn, jealousy hatched, and now we stand at the threshold of the densest test. The morning will come with its proclamation. The king will make a declaration that will reach beyond his palace to the nations. But before that proclamation, before the chorus of voices, there is the quiet of the den, the closeness of peril, the faithful habit of prayer that had carried Daniel from a ruined city to this very pit. The history has thus far shown a pattern. God works through the ordinary, through food choices and prayer rhythms, through the interpreters of dreams and the quiet refusal to compromise. Daniel's fidelity has already created ripples. How those ripples will become a roaring witness to kings and peoples is what the next hours will reveal. For now, the reader may imagine Daniel in the dark, small, unfevered, his lips moving with a prayer that is both the echo of exile and the affirmation of God's presence. O Lord, remember your servant. Be my strength. The words are simple. Their power lies in their constancy. And from the palace above, Darius, who had admired Daniel and now felt the iron of the law upon his soul, waits with the weight of an oath heavy on his brow, wondering whether the God he has heard spoken of will act as the stories claim. The king's heart, though bound by statute, is not unsoftened. He will soon plead, not with a God of ritual, but with the living God, over the fate of a man who had taught him what loyalty could look like in a foreign court. This is where our telling pauses, at the hinge between the injustice of a law and the possibility of divine intervention, at the place where a man of prayer sits amid peril and the dawn is about to break. The elements are in place, the jealousy, the decree, the faithful obedience, the sleepless king, and the narrative breathes toward the moment when the lion's den will either be the grave of testimony or the stage of glory. The rest of the story moves from this tension to a revelation that will alter the speech of kings and the testimony of nations. Dawn opened like a wound of light along the eastern horizon, pale and surgical, cutting the night into and out of itself. In the pale wash of first day, the palace seemed smaller and more honest, no longer glittering with pretense, merely stone and shadow, a place where oaths and decrees lay like settled dust. Darius, who had known power in measured ways, moved through the corridors with the sudden clumsiness of a man who had woken in the wrong country, his face raw with regret, his robe a poor armor against the sense of having been outmaneuvered by his own law. He had not slept. The king's restlessness was not merely royal impatience. It was the conscience of a ruler who had set the machinery of government in motion, and then discovered it could not be stopped by regret. He walked until he reached the outer court where servants spoke in low tones, and lantern light made pools of amber. Then he halted at the stone edge that marked the place the den had been sealed. For a time he stood there, hands clenched, listening to the palace breathe as if it had lungs. The page came, small, dusty, hurried, bearing the dreadful tidings that had been framed with legal neatness. Daniel had been cast into the den. The king's stomach folded, and in that folding his heart said aloud the only thing a man can say when law becomes a shackle: "O Lord, have mercy." It was not ritual. It was not the stringing of formulas learned at court. It was a human being finding the last resort of an honest soul. He rushed then, more by the momentum of grief than by command. The crowd that gathered at the den's mouth did not cheer. They did not dare. Their silence was a fabric of fear and curiosity that covered the courtyard. Darius, with a tremor in his hand, ordered the stone rolled away. The guards obeyed. The stone scraped. Dust fell in a faint gray fan, and the aperture framed the dark like a pupil. He called into the pit with the depth of a man who had spent the night bargaining with a God he had not yet fully known to be the God of mercy. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve been able to deliver you from the lions?" For a moment there was only the hollow echo of his own voice and the sound of the men at his side, breathing, shifting. And then, as if the day itself embodied the news, a voice answered from the darkness, clear, alive, steady. "O King, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him, and also before you, O King. I have done no wrong." The words moved like a wind through linen. Simple testimony, no boast. Just a fact uttered by a man who had been disciplined by prayer to speak the truth plainly. The effect upon the king was instantaneous. The monarch's lips parted and he laughed. Not the hollow laughter of nobles at spectacle, but a raw human sound that had in it wonder, relief, and amazement. He sprang to the pit and ordered Daniel drawn up. Hands that had been raised to bind a prisoner now labored to lift a living witness. When Daniel stood again upon dry ground, his face was not the face of one who had been conquered. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of having prayed through the dark. But his bearing was the same steady dignity that had marked him in the court. Not defiant, only faithful. Darius embraced him then in a motion that was as much apology as gratitude, an awkward embrace between sovereign and servant, a king acknowledging he had been taught something larger than law. Those around them craned forward to see what had happened. Some covered their mouths in astonishment. Others looked at each other with the wary stiffness of men who have watched their plans disintegrate. The conspirators, whose faces had been composed like masks through the night, now found themselves exposed. The law they had bent into a snare had turned on their own intention. The king, refusing to let the moment pass as private sentiment, ruled that justice be done in the fashion the law allowed, unmasking cruelty with its own mechanisms. There is a sober and terrible thing about legalistic vengeance. It can look decorous while it accomplishes ruin. So the plotters received the penalty they had constructed for another. The court's instruments, orders, seals, ritual procedure, took the conspirators in their turn. They were executed in the manner that a fallen conspiracy deserved in that place and time. Their families were left to bear the social cost. The narration of those outcomes in the ancient records is not a festive flourish, but a sober accounting. Men who schemed to use law as a blade found the sword returned to its sheath against them. The palace then felt the double shock of that reversal, the relief at Daniel's survival, and the uneasy silence that follows when justice has been done with the same hand that penned the law. If the reader needs the moral plainly stated, it is this: when men fashion law to gratify private animus, even the most respectable institutions become instruments of ruin. The episode is not merely about retributive balance, It is a caution that calls rulers and citizens alike to examine whether their rules serve a public good or private vengeance. The Book of Daniel insists on that clarity. The same legalism that bound Daniel cannot be allowed to chip away at the conscience of a kingdom without consequences. Darius did something that morning that surprised the assembly. He made a proclamation. Standing in the court amid the hush, his voice carried in the way that royal proclamations do, not merely as an assertion of power but as an education in truth for a people. He declared that in every part of his realm, people should fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. He commended the living God who had rescued his faithful servant, and commanded that reverence for that God be taught throughout the nations under his authority. O gods of 1,000 shrines, the king seemed to say by implication, you have not kept this man safe. The God who answers prayer has shown himself. The decree was not theological nuance given discretion. It was a political confession. A king acknowledging that imperial machinery had limits before a divine reality. In proclaiming God's sovereignty, Darius also sought to write the moral ledger of his rule. The text preserves this as a remarkable turn. An empire's ruler, confronted by the pattern of God acting in the life of an exile, chooses to pronounce the Lord's greatness publicly. For Daniel, restoration followed. He was brought back into high station, promoted even under Darius's reign. His responsibilities expanded because his integrity had been made visible, and his competence publicly vindicated. The narrative does not pretend that this path was an easy reward to grasp. Favor often arrives wrapped in complicated human responses. Still, Daniel's life now acted as a living letter, an epistle written across policy and palace. Devotion that challenges power can, in time, transform it. There is a theological rhythm running through these events that deserves attention. The same God who closed mouths in the den is the God who revealed dreams to kings, who preserved lives in furnaces, who humbled the proud. The pattern is consistent, and the narrative emphasizes this unity. Divine action is not arbitrary. It is purposeful, often pedagogical. God acts to instruct, to reveal, to humble, and to show that what looks like absolute human authority is encompassed by a larger sovereignty. The reader is invited, not to intellectualize the point, but to sit in the wonder of a God who uses the small fidelity of one person to teach nations. There is also in these chapters a subtle teaching about the nature of witness. Daniel's life testified to God in the ordinary more than the extraordinary in a way that made his eventual deliverance credible to those who watched. His refusal to hide his prayer habit, his steady ethics in office, his humility before the king, these small acts coalesced into a force of witness. The narrative suggests that the great moments of miracle are rarely detached spectacles. They arrive in the context of long fidelity. The den did not create Daniel's reputation out of nothing. Rather, it confirmed the trajectory shaped by years of obedience. If we step back for a moment to consider what the book accomplishes, we see an argument for the public role of faith. Daniel did not withdraw his trust into private corners. He carried it into the councils of empire, into the bureaucracy of a foreign land, and there his faith bore witness. The result was not universal acceptance. It was a testimony that both attracted admiration and provoked hostility. Yet the ultimate movement of the narrative is not toward personal triumph, but toward the revelation of God's rule over rulers. There remain, however, more shadows to consider. Daniel's deliverance did not erase the presence of spiritual adversaries hinted at earlier. Later in the book, the text will speak in bolder strokes about angelic beings, Gabriel and Michael, whose activity alludes to a cosmic stage upon which earthly politics are only one scene. The story before us does not demand exhaustive explanation of those realities. It simply acknowledges that prayer and revelation intersect with a spiritual economy. To press the point too far would be to speculate beyond what the text allows. Yet it is worth stating plainly. The faithful life engaged in persistent prayer participates in a wider drama. After Daniel's restoration, the court and the empire did not become a haven of unanimous belief. Politics remained messy, and human hearts did not all turn in the same direction. But the proclamation of Darius did leave a mark. The king's decree that all should honor the God of Daniel is preserved as a record of how God sometimes uses the conscience of a ruler to communicate truth to many. The world is a place of mixed motives, and yet even a ruler swayed by personal relief can inadvertently become a herald of God's name. The narrative now steps forward in time with plausible transitions. Daniel continued to serve with distinction, he continued to pray, and he continued to be used by God to interpret visions that concerned the rise and fall of empires. These visions, images of beasts, horns, and heavenly messengers, are given later in the book in language that is intentionally cosmic and symbolic. For our present purposes, they function as a horizon. Daniel's story is not merely local. It points beyond the immediate miracle of rescue to the idea that God rules the long arc of history. Here, briefly, one may note that Daniel's interpretations of dreams and visions established a theological claim that the fate of nations is not random, but subject to divine oversight. That claim would have consequences for how rulers and peoples understand their fate. There is, in the final chapters of Daniel, an ethic for those who would be watchers. Do the small things well, keep the habits of prayer, and let integrity shape public action. When the day comes that the world places you in a pit, your habitual fidelity will be the measure by which God may choose to act. Faith is not a strategy for avoiding hardship. It is a form of endurance that can become the stage of God's revelation. Now, as the narrative travels toward conclusion, it is important to dwell a moment on the quality of Daniel's prayer in the den. It was not a performative cry designed to win notice. It was the plain speech of a man who had been taught to speak to God often and without artifice. "O Lord," he had said earlier in moments of danger, "be with me. Help your servant." In the den he repeated such petitions, not to manipulate a miracle, but to align himself with the God he had always faced. That manner of prayer is the recurring image the book leaves with the reader. Prayer as habitual, prayer as identity. If the reader is inclined toward practical application, consider what Daniel models. He shows that fidelity is cultivated by small choices, the 10-day diet, the upright administration of duties, the refusal to privatize faith out of convenience. Each habit of fidelity reduces the risk that a moment of crisis will find a person unmoored. The story urges believers to think about devotion as character-forming, rather than merely outcome-producing. The miracle that comes at the den is not a formula to replicate, but a testimony to a heart practiced in prayer. There is a pastoral dimension to draw out before the tale closes. Many will hear this account and wonder why faithful people suffer, why God sometimes allows his servants to be cast into pits. The answer the text, claimed with both honesty and mystery, offers is not formulaic. Suffering is part of the texture of a present age that includes both testimony and testing. Yet God is present within that texture, able to rescue and often choosing moments of apparent ruin to display his glory in such a way that kings and nations may be instructed. The presence of God in suffering does not eliminate pain, but it does change its meaning. A trial can be a place of witness and of formation. We should also note how courage is depicted. Daniel's bravery was not a flash of stoic showmanship. It was the patient courage of the one who had slowly built a life around simple practices. Courage in this story is the fruit of steady obedience. That is an encouraging word for those who find themselves in long seasons of test. Keep turning toward God. The habit matters more than the spectacle. There remains one other practical point to address: the use of law to justify cruelty. The conspirators in Daniel's story weaponized legal formality. That is a reality that ancient courts and modern institutions share in common. Law can be turned into a tool for personal gain. The narrative insists that the witness of the faithful can expose such misuse. Daniel's vindication was both a personal rescue and a revelation that law, while essential, can be twisted. Those who govern should be vigilant that the forms of justice do not become means of personal vendetta. After these reflections, the story moves gently toward its final beat. Daniel spent the remainder of his days in honors during the reign of Darius and into the era of Cyrus, and his reputation endured. He was a man whom kings consulted and whom history remembers as a faithful interpreter and a steadfast witness. The narrative closes not with the end of worldly struggle, but with an affirmation. God is sovereign, and those who remain faithful, even in exile, can become instruments of God's testimony to rulers and peoples. Before we close with an application to the heart, it is fitting to mention briefly the broader horizon hinted at in Daniel's visions. Empires rise and fall. Symbols of beasts and horns and stones portray more than mere politics. They suggest that nations are woven into a larger story, where God's kingdom ultimately overwrites all human sovereignties. The book leaves the reader with a confident curiosity. The present may be fraught, but a greater throne endures. This is the theological summit of the narrative. God's kingdom is the abiding reference by which the temporary patterns of power are judged. So, what should the modern listener carry from Daniel's battle in the lion's den? First, that faith under trial is not oddity but vocation. A life disciplined by prayer and integrity prepares one to stand when tests come. Second, that God often chooses to act through ordinary faithfulness rather than theatrical schemes. Third, that the witness of a single life can instruct rulers and shape a nation's conscience. Fourth, that the misuse of law to persecute the faithful is a recurring human failing that requires vigilance and moral clarity. This story, then, is an invitation and a challenge. It invites us to cultivate the small, steady disciplines of prayer and ethical living that form character. It challenges us not to hide our faith behind an acceptable private curtain when public life calls for witness. The cost of such witness may be high, but the narrative of Daniel shows that the cost can sometimes be the context in which God most clearly reveals his power. Let us make the application intimate. If you face a season where the structures around you threaten your devotion, remember the discipline pictured in Daniel's life. If you are tempted to compromise small things, because compromise is rarely sudden and often incremental, recall how the 10-day choice at a palace table became a defining posture. If you find your faith tested by unjust laws or by people who use institutions to harm, remember the den. The moral worthiness of a life persists even when legal definitions turn harsh. As we come to a close, there is room for a short prayer, not as a ritual, but as the kind of speech that framed Daniel's own life. Join that simple tone for a moment. O Lord, faithful and sovereign, in the quiet places of our days, teach us the discipline of prayer. Grant us the courage to stand when the cost is high, and the wisdom to act with integrity in small things. When trial comes, be our refuge. When justice is twisted, be our vindicator. Let our lives point to your rule, and may our witness lead others to know your name. Amen. If Daniel's steadfast faith moved you, share this with someone who needs courage, and subscribe to walk through more stories of faith with us.